Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope you're doing exceedingly well. So much love to each and every one of you, and I just hope you're doing really, really well. And don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or tea or whatever it is that you drink, because I've got my hot cup of tea here right now, and there's nothing better than a hot beverage. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Russell, although people tend to call me Russ for short, and I'm from Wisconsin, which is a Midwestern state in the United States of America, well known for its two magnificent Great Lakes, namely Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, with an interior of dreamy forests and ubiquitous natural farmland. I grew up in the delightful city of Elk Grove in an exquisite lakefront property with sensational panoramic views. At the time of my story, I resided in one of those typical ranch-style homes with both of my parents and my sporty, adventurous sister Carly. Wisconsin is also known as the Great White North, where we experience winter like few other places in Northern America, which is why they call this the frozen tundra, for indeed some of our cities are considered colder than places in Alaska. Growing up in the early 90s, my sister and I were incredibly privileged and fortunate to have a very idyllic, peaceful and pleasurable childhood, as our happy-go-lucky parents were mellow, long-suffering and undemanding people who barely ever got their feathers ruffled and never raised their voices at us once, nor did they ever swear or lose their tempers. For indeed, the only time I ever once heard my mother release an F-bomb is when she slammed her toe really hard into a wooden cabinet and hurt herself quite badly, and another time when she was removing a chocolate cake from the oven and unfortunately slipped and plunged the cake and its contents all over the floor. Both our fun-loving parents actively encouraged us to spend all our spare time out of doors. My father emphatically believed fresh air and exercise would make us hale and hearty and were essential tools for all growing kids. I always adored the panoramic, exquisite snow-covered white landscapes of the winter months and the large mountain slopes in Wisconsin. It enabled me to develop a reverent passion for challenging winter sports like cross-country skiing, snowboarding and snowshoeing, as there was no end to the fun activities you can engage in with the snow. Little did I realise that my appreciation for the cold weather and this intriguing white substance from nature would ultimately impact my career path later on in life, as you will soon discover. My first idiosyncratic, unorthodox encounter with the hairy critter, otherwise known as Bigfoot, was on our own property, where the rear of our land was surrounded by a dense area of woodgreen, consisting of very mature statuesque aspen, beeches and birch trees. Those were the days when we never had heard of Bigfoot before, so my first encounter with the strange creature was nothing short of incredulous. It all began in the winter of 1993, when my sister and I constructed a very sizable, cheerful-looking snowman in our backyard, which was something we did every single winter like clockwork after heavy snowfall. After all, every backyard should be graced with the presence of a quintessential snowman in winter. Our snowman would wear my father's old black bowler hat on his head, with blue marbles for its eyes, a massive carrot for its nose, and several red glacé cherries for its mouth, along with a striped scarf that belonged to my father around its neck. It would seem that the nose and the mouth kept needing replacing regularly, because the carrots and cherries would mysteriously vanish, and we were perturbed as to who or what was pinching the carrots and the cherries. I was secretly convinced my father was playing tricks on us, as he had a wacko sense of humour at the time and was the greatest trickster of all. But he insisted that he was not stealing our carrots, nor taking the cherries. One day my sister Carly and I awoke to find that not only were the carrots and cherries mysteriously missing from the snowman, but there was actually a long trail of telltale footprints that led directly from the snowman into the heart of the woods. "Look," I said to my sister, "I think these footprints belong to the perpetrator of our missing carrots and cherries." "But the feet are so big," said my sister, putting her foot into the huge impression in the ground. "Look how big the print is compared to my own foot." I was stunned by how tiny my sister's foot was compared to these footprints in the snow. Who could have feet this big, I wondered, for you'd have to be like a giant to have feet this large. It was a curious conundrum for me. In our eager enthusiasm and heightened curiosity, we began to follow the trail of footprints directly in the snow to the heart of the woods. Imagine our immense surprise when they led directly to a large igloo-like structure that would have been very inconspicuous to us if the footprints hadn't been such a clear giveaway sign. Whoever this individual was, he clearly wasn't very good at concealing his tracks. The sizable rounded shell-like structure was exceedingly large and very cleverly constructed, with a vast framework of tree branches that were used as the scaffolding that was cemented together with dense quantities of snow. The snow-covered frame was set against a rocky outcrop that I imagine provided a great windbreak. My sister and I crept up to the igloo to peek inside, and we could see this large bundle of grey fur lying curled up in a large ball, with its back facing away from us. It looked like a massive fur coat lying in this space. The strange critter appeared to be snoring loudly, and he sounded exactly like my dad, who really does snort like a pig when he sleeps, something which drives my mother insanely crazy. At first I thought it must be a bear that was lying in this igloo, but then bears don't have grey hair, do they? I also remembered the footprints in the snow that clearly did not belong to a bear. Besides, I've never heard of a bear coming out of hibernation to pinch a few carrots and a handful of glacé cherries. My sister and I cautiously crept away from the shelter and surreptitiously hid behind a very large, sizable birch tree, while I deliberately threw a large snowball at the igloo, in the hope that we could rouse the unsuspecting critter out of its deep slumber. And it seemed to have worked. Fortunately, our snowball did make a loud crashing sound as it thumped against the opening. That was when we saw the massive critter tentatively stick his huge pyramid-shaped head out of the igloo, with a startled, bewildered and befuddled expression upon his long, wrinkled, human-like face. He began furtively looking around him, to the left and to the right, and to the front and to the back, and then prudently inspecting his structure to ensure that it wasn't falling apart. We watched in awe as this elderly critter hobbled around his den, examining it from every side and angle, moving ever so slowly. He proceeded to cement some more snow onto the igloo with his massive hands, and finally satisfied, retreated back into his structure. I think he must have believed that some snow had literally come off his igloo, and he was trying to fix it. My sister and I stared at this thing in disbelief, because this doddering critter looked exactly like a man, but he wasn't fully human, as there were fleeting ape-like influences to his humanoid appearance. We could tell that the critter was long in the tooth, for he shuffled around like a geriatric old man, and looked dithery and muddled, which made him rather endearing to us. I would describe him as being about 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, and covered with long, flowing, exceedingly matted grey hair, with bald patches on his knees, parts of his chest, and under his arms. I could discern that the shrivelling, enfeebled critter was suffering from the withering, decaying effects of severe muscular wastage, and was very thin, emaciated and lanky, but I believe at one time in his prime he must have been very large indeed. I was not afraid of the critter at all, because he seemed like a likeable, disorientated old man, and I actually felt incredibly sorry for him, alone in the snow like this. "What is he?" asked my sister earnestly, as we made tracks back to the house. "He looks human, but not quite human. You know what I mean." "I don't know," I said, "but I think that whatever he is, he's very old and is struggling to survive. It's hard out here in the cruel elements, and judging by how slow and dithery he is, I can't imagine that he's much of a hunter. I honestly don't know how he's managing to survive out there, on his own. Nature can be so cruel. That's why he probably was pinching our carrot and our glacé cherries." "We must help him," said my sister. "I feel ever so sorry for him. He looks so lost and confused. I mean, where is his family? Should they not be taking care of him? Why have they abandoned him like this?" "Well, maybe they're migrants," I suggested, "and left him behind for the winter because he's too slow to accompany them to a warmer place." I knew I wanted to help the strange critter living in the igloo, for who or whatever he was most certainly past his prime, and desperately needed our help. And if he'd been stealing the carrots from our snowman, he must be very hungry indeed, and that bothered me greatly. Over the weeks that followed, my sister and I would throw snowy balls at the igloo to awaken the critter from his sleep. He would rustle around in the igloo, hobbling out of the opening, and he would find apples, carrots, brown bread and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches outside his igloo. We would hide behind a tree, watching the critter. He would look so puzzled as he studied the food on the ground, and his expression was so dumbfounded and astonished. We would watch him scratching his head, and the wrinkles on his forehead would crinkle up deeply, as if he was wondering where on earth the food had come from. On one occasion, a large bird flew over the igloo-like structure, and his eyes lit up brightly, and he waved excitedly at the bird. I'm convinced he thought the bird had sent him manna from heaven. Sometimes when we left food out for him, he would look around him with his concerned deep eyes, looking from the right and to the left, and even up the trees, as if trying to discern where the food had mysteriously appeared from. And then he would quickly grab the food and hastily retreat back into the igloo, almost as if he was worried that something or someone would try and steal it away from him. I knew that we were making his life a whole lot easier and better by bringing him food, and it felt good to help the poor critter. One day we threw a snowball at the igloo, and the critter did not respond to us at all, and that happened for several consecutive days. By this stage I was certain that the critter was dead, and of course I was right, because we went into the cave and surreptitiously reached into the opening to poke the critter very hard with a stick. He did not respond to us at all, so we poked him even harder, and he still did not react. That was when I reached out to touch the critter with my hand, and he was as hard as a brick and as solid as ice. The poor critter must have died in his sleep, and my sister and I began to cry because we had grown so fond of him. For several days my sister and I spent ages digging a hole in the ground for the critter, and we dragged him along the ground and pushed him into the shallow grave. We conducted our own little funeral service for him because he was so alone in the world, and we felt that he deserved to have a decent send-off. I don't know why we never told our parents about this incident, but then my sister and I were never big talkers at the very best of times, and our parents really never knew what we got up to anyway. Fast forward to my late 20s, when after being a rookie for a few years, I eventually became a fully fledged snowcat operator, and by this time in my life, regretfully I had 2 failed marriages behind me, and was getting married for the 3rd and hopefully final time. My parents were despairing with me over my inability to keep my wives happy, and blamed me for the demise of both of my relationships. You know what your problem is, darling? You're not giving your wives enough attention, my mother moaned at me. You need to spoil them, and give them compliments once in a while. What exactly do you mean? I asked her. Oh, Russ, my mother would groan. Did I not teach you anything growing up? You need to say things like, darling, your hair looks so beautiful today, and I love your dress. But what if I don't like her hair, I said. And what if I don't like her dress? Just say it, my mother snapped. Even if you don't mean it, and if she asks you if her bum looks fat in her dress, for goodness sake make sure you say no, because no woman needs to hear the truth. Why? I asked. Why would I lie to my wife? Because I say so, that's why, said my mother. And then she continued, when did you last tell your wife that you loved her? Well, I told her once, I said. Isn't that enough? No, it's not, darling, said my mother. You need to say it often, Russ. Women need to feel loved. It's important to tell them that you love them often. She continued in her instruction. You should occasionally buy your wife a fancy bouquet of flowers. Women love flowers. And chocolates, of course. Then occasionally take her out for a romantic candlelit dinner. You have to put some effort into your relationship, Russ, darling, because everything in life takes work. You know, Russ, what it's like when you're fixing the snow after the skiers have messed it up. It takes hours of work for you in that snowcat of yours to smooth out all their mess. It's the same with a marriage, she told me. It takes work, plenty of commitment, and lots of appreciation. I don't want to make excuses for myself, as my mother made some valid points, but I do think my job as a snow groomer had a great deal to do with the failure of my 2 former marriages, as both my wives felt that I was never around for them in the evening for that quintessential glass of white wine and a cosy dinner for 2. And even when I was around, I was never much of a talker. It would seem that being a poor communicator and a very contained person only caused my wives to become more embittered towards me. I have learnt that divorce is not uncommon among people working in the night shift, especially during the weekends when couples enjoy being social together, and both my wives were always on their own at social functions, and they hated feeling like a wallflower at these events. When most people pack up to return home after a heavy day at work, I'm invariably only just getting started. I really love and appreciate my job on the ski slopes as a snowcat operator, where I spend hours at a time with myself, listening to my stereo music, undoing what the skiers spent the day doing as they roughed up and messed up the ski slopes substantially, which is where using my snowcat comes into play. Over the years, I've learnt to skillfully and masterfully manoeuvre the snow from the slopes back uphill towards the centre of the trails. Then I resurface and refresh the snow, following all the grooming plans that I've been given for that particular night by my superior. I truly consider my job the most exciting, rewarding job in the world, because it really is like a sport in a manner of speaking. There are, of course, times when you get motion sickness from all the constant jerking around in the vehicle and the swinging back and forth in the snowcat, which can, of course, induce feelings of nausea and queasiness. It is very stressful when visibility is not good, so over the years I've used the tree line as a reference point and guide. There have been times that I've actually slipped and skidded badly and literally fallen out of my cab, and that is not funny, I assure you. On those occasions I've literally had to drag myself out of the snow and get back into my snowcat, because there's no one to help you. It can be incredibly lonely out there, as you're all on your own. It's important not to be afraid of the blizzards or heavy wind conditions, as you have to operate the cat in all manner of conditions, so it's not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. You have to learn the mountains you're grooming like the back of your hands, taking into account where you might have a sheer cliff face on one side and trees on another, and you cannot see a thing. Sometimes it's a little like driving a powerful vehicle blindfolded over treacherous, slippery and dangerous terrain. One evening I wasn't feeling at all well. I remember I had a throbbing headache, a sore throat, and was coughing quite a lot. I decided to take a medication that I didn't know at the time had sedative-like side effects. Not good when you're operating heavy machinery, I can assure you of that. I returned to my snowcat, which was covered in an ethereal blue glow from the full moon that night. As I began to groom the slope, I became increasingly disorientated and groggy, but instead of having the common sense to call it a day, I continued to groom the slopes, and at one point I got out of my cab to examine something on the ground. I could feel that my temperature was soaring, and although it was -2 degrees outside, I was sweating like a pig. I got back into my cab and I saw the hazy, somewhat blurry silhouettes of two dark figures playing together in the snow, throwing snowballs at each other. They were running around and chasing each other, seemingly having the time of their lives, but it was 11 o'clock at night. I could hardly believe it. They were a fair distance away from me, so I couldn't see them very clearly, but I do remember thinking that no one should be playing on the slopes at this time of night or messing up the snow like this for my snowcat to fix. I got out of my cab to have a better view of the two mysterious people, and due to my groggy, disorientated state, I really wasn't looking to where I was going, and I slipped, lost my balance, and went rolling and plummeting down the steep slope towards the two people like a massive lumbering dough ball, when finally I reached the bottom and came to a grinding halt. I could hear 2 feet racing towards me very fast, and I looked up to see 2 faces staring down at me that were clearly wondering what the strange thing was that had come tumbling down the hill at such an insane speed. The 2 critters that were checking me out possessed the same pyramid-like faces of the critter I'd encountered as a child. I was so stunned by what I was seeing that my eyes grew as round as saucers and my mouth dropped open. I don't know who was more bewildered, the critters or me. For a moment all 3 of us were locked in a stare, none of us quite knowing how to react to each other. I felt so drunk and intoxicated from the medication, but that did not impair the escalating terror rising up in my heart. I knew I was in the presence of 2 of the most intimidating, enormous critters that I have ever encountered in my entire life, and something dangerous and as threatening as a lion or a tiger, believe me. Without question, these critters were majestic, lofty, powerful, and exceedingly formidable. When you're face to face with something this colossal, you become judiciously aware of how small and vulnerable you are in the great scheme of things. I would say these critters were easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 feet across the shoulders, and they were covered in jet black long hair that was a little scant on the midsection, only serving to highlight the taut, powerful muscle definition beneath. I could see this clearly in the light of the full moon. The critters both possessed very powerful shoulders, overlong arms, and short, stocky legs, and their deep-set dark eyes reflected a very menacing red eye-shine. In my terror and desperate need to escape, it would seem that my ungainly body malfunctioned, while my brain kept screaming at me to run. The only way I can describe it to you, it was like my brain disengaged and misfired, and my faulty body failed to start up like an old rusty car engine. I became cloddish, uncoordinated and oafish. I tried to gain my composure, staggering precariously to my feet, but in my gallant, courageous, best efforts to manoeuvre my body efficiently off the ground, I slipped and lost my balance, not just once, but 3 more consecutive times. I believe my terror had stiffened and frozen my body like a large block of cement, and it didn't help that the woozy, sedative effects of my medication were fogging up my mind considerably. I could tell by the expressions on the critter's face that they thought I was exceedingly clumsy and graceless. I discerned that my uncoordinated staggering around the snow, like an inebriated, sizzled and impaired drunk, was a source of great amusement for them both. I promise you that those critters were snorting so much that I sensed that they were definitely laughing at me, and having a joke at my expense. After a while, one critter began to feel desperately sorry for me. He gathered me in his overlong arms like a bird with a broken wing that he wanted to rescue, throwing me gently over his shoulders like a large sack of oranges, carrying me up the steep, precarious slope with effortless ease and with a seamless fluidity, without a single jolt, while his friend walked by his side, and they chatted merrily together like 2 people talking a strange language. Finally, the critter plonked me on the ground next to my snowcat. He then turned around with his friend, and it was like they were gliding as they moved away with such an extraordinary grace down the steep slope. They swung their arms backwards and forwards. I watched them in awe for a long while from my snowcat as they continued to throw snowballs at each other, seemingly unfazed by the fact that I could see them clearly. I kept thinking to myself, am I rarely seeing this, or is this the side effect of my cold medication playing tricks on me? The next few days at work, many of the snowcat operators were commenting about the large trails of human-like tracks seen all over the steep hills, and people were very floored about the size of these imprints that had messed up the snow. I kept my mouth shut and never said a single word about what I'd seen on the slopes. All these years later, I'm still grooming the snow in the late afternoon, after the slopes are closed once the skiers have left. There have been occasions I've sensed my snowcat being watched, or seen a large tree in the wood green suddenly taking on a human form and moving, and that's when I instinctively know I'm perceiving the critters that I now know to be Bigfoots. In truth, I'm glad they're out there watching over the slopes, as they've never given us any problems and seem benevolent and benign, although I must confess an encounter with one of these critters can be very spooky indeed. I'm glad to confess that I'm still married to wife number 3, who is not concerned by the strange hours I work, and one of the reasons I think my marriage actually works is my wife doesn't expect me to make her happy. She believes everyone is responsible for their own happiness, and I love the fact that she accepts me for who I am and doesn't expect me to be a huge talker. Instead, she enjoys talking and I love to listen, so our relationship really works. I've learnt to tell her I love her often, but I draw the line at pretending she looks good in a dress if she doesn't, and if her bum looks big, I'd probably tell her, so I'm not big on the lie thing. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fabulous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.